On the 19th of February, 2026, a 12-year-old boy named Nizan Shafi took his last breath in a hospital in Sukabumi, Indonesia. Tonight, his story. Sukabumi is a city in West Java, Indonesia, sitting between two volcanic mountains, Mount Gede to the northeast and Mount Salak to the northwest. And these mountains shape everything about this city in ways that outsiders rarely appreciate. That a 12-year-old boy named Nizan Shafi was living a life that was anything but ordinary in the worst possible sense of that word. Because what was happening inside the walls of that house was something the outside world could not see. Something that left no visible mark on the facade of normalcy that daily life requires every family to maintain. And understanding that invisible nature of what Nizan endured is one of the most important things we can take from his story. Because it is precisely that invisibility that allowed it to continue for as long as it did. Nizan was 12 years old and in the 6th grade at the time of his death. And 12 is a number that deserves more than a passing mention, because it is so easy to hear an age and let it pass through the mind as just a number, just a data point in a story. But 12 years old is not a data point. 12 years old is a specific and irreplaceable stage of human life. It is the age of the crossroads, as educators in Indonesia often describe it. The end of primary school and the beginning of the longer and more serious journey through junior high and eventually senior high, and then the wide-open uncertainty of adulthood. A 12-year-old child in Indonesia is typically in the final year of Sekolah Dasar, primary school, preparing for the transition to Sekolah Menengah Pertama, junior high, school. And this transition carries genuine emotional and social weight for Indonesian children and their families, because it represents the first major milestone of the educational journey. The first moment when a child begins to be treated as something slightly more than a child. When expectations shift and responsibilities grow, and the world outside the home begins to exert a more powerful gravitational pull. And Nizan was standing at exactly that threshold. He was the age of beginning something new, of stepping through a door into a larger version of his own life. And instead, the door that opened for him in February of 2026 was not the one he should have walked through. It was not the door of a new school uniform and a new classroom, and new friendships formed in the nervous first weeks of junior high. It was the door of a hospital ward, and it was the door of a police investigation, and ultimately it was the door that none of us want to think about. The one that closes permanently and admits no return. He lived with his father and his stepmother, and it is important to be precise about what that family structure means and what it does not mean. Because the presence of a step-parent in a child's life is statistically and socially unremarkable. Indonesia has one of the highest rates of divorce and remarriage in Southeast Asia, and blended families are an entirely normal feature of Indonesian domestic life. Millions of Indonesian children are raised in households with step-parents, and the vast majority of those households function with genuine love and appropriate care and the kind of stability that children need to develop into healthy adults. The step-parent relationship is not inherently dangerous, and it would be both inaccurate and unfair to suggest otherwise. What matters in any household is not its structure, but its internal dynamics, not the legal or biological relationships between the adults and the children. but the actual lived experience of the child inside that space. Whether the child feels safe, whether the child is fed and clothed and educated and protected, whether the child can cry without fear and speak without punishment and make mistakes without violence. And in Nizan's case, the internal dynamics of that household had become something that the Indonesian authorities would describe using the phrase alleged physical and psychological violence. And I want to slow down on those two words, physical and psychological, because together they paint a picture that is more complete and more disturbing than either word alone. Physical violence means the body was being harmed. Physical violence means that Nizan's body, the body of a 12-year-old child, was being used as a site of punishment and control. But psychological violence means something that goes even deeper than the physical injuries. Because psychological violence means the mind was also being targeted. The sense of self, the capacity for trust, the ability to feel safe in the one place on earth that is supposed to be a refuge. And when investigators used both of those words together, they were telling us that what Nizan experienced was comprehensive. It was total. It was a harm that had penetrated every layer of his existence. The exact timeline of when the abuse began and how it escalated over the months or years leading up to February 2026 has not been publicly disclosed by Indonesian authorities. And this is standard practice in active criminal investigations, where releasing too much information too early can compromise the integrity of the legal process. But what the forensic evidence discovered during and after Nizan's hospitalization strongly suggested to investigators was that the night of February 2026 was not the beginning of his suffering. It was the culmination of it. It was the point at which the accumulated harm reached a level that the human body could no longer survive. And the evidence for this lies in the autopsy findings, which documented not only the injuries that caused his death, but older injuries, pre-existing injuries, permanent injuries to his lips and nasal area that had already been incorporated into the tissue in a way that indicated they had been sustained some time before the final incident. Injuries to the face that bore the characteristics of repeated blunt force trauma rather than a single impact. And this evidence of prior harm is one of the most significant forensic findings in the entire case, because it transforms the legal and moral character of what happened to Nizan from a single terrible act into a pattern of deliberate and sustained abuse. And patterns of sustained abuse in domestic settings do not happen without the child developing a set of survival behaviors, a set of adaptations designed to minimize harm and avoid triggering further violence. And these adaptations often include staying very quiet, becoming very still, learning to read the moods and movements of the person causing harm with a level of precision that no child should ever need to develop. And whether Nizan had developed these adaptations, we cannot know from the public record. But we know that despite whatever he had learned to do in order to survive inside that house, it was not enough. Because in February 2026, the harm that was done to him exceeded what survival could accommodate. Nizan was brought to a hospital in Sukabumi, and the medical team that received him found injuries that were immediately and unambiguously serious. He had burns, extensive burns, and the word extensive here is being used in its clinical sense, meaning widespread. meaning covering significant portions of the body, meaning not the kind of burn that you treat with cold water and a bandage and a few days of rest. These were burns that required hospitalization and urgent medical intervention, and the most critical finding was the internal burns, the damage to his internal organs, which were consistent with one specific mechanism of injury: the ingestion of a high-temperature liquid, specifically boiling water. And I want to be careful and precise here because precision matters in cases like this one. Boiling water reaches a temperature of 100 degrees Celsius at standard atmospheric pressure, and when a liquid at or near that temperature is swallowed, it causes immediate and catastrophic damage to every tissue surface it contacts: the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the stomach, the surrounding organs, and the nature of this damage is different from a surface burn in important ways. Surface burns are painful and serious, but they are visible and they can be treated with appropriate wound care. Internal burns of the esophagus and gastrointestinal tract are extraordinarily difficult to treat, and they carry a high risk of complications, including infection, organ failure, and death. And the degree of internal organ damage that Nizan sustained, as documented in the autopsy, was severe. It was the kind of damage that represents not a brief contact with hot liquid, but a sustained ingestion of it. And this forensic detail is what made Nizan's own account to investigators not only credible, but corroborated. Because the physical evidence inside his body told exactly the same story that his words told to the police. In addition to the internal injuries, the medical team documented multiple blunt force injuries on Nizan's face when he arrived at the hospital. Injuries that were consistent with being struck, with being hit with a hand or an object with sufficient force to leave visible marks on the face of a 12-year-old child. And the autopsy confirmed that some of these facial injuries, particularly the damage to his lips and nose, were permanent, meaning they had already begun to heal and incorporate into the tissue before the final incident, meaning they were not from the same night, meaning Nizan had been carrying these marks on his face for some time. And this detail matters enormously in the construction of the criminal case because it establishes a pattern. It establishes that the violence was not spontaneous, was not a single moment of rage that led to terrible consequences, but was instead a repeated and deliberate practice of causing physical harm to a child. And this distinction between spontaneous violence and patterned, deliberate violence is one that Indonesian prosecutors will need to establish clearly in court when the case eventually reaches trial, because it speaks directly to the question of intent and to the question of what charges are most appropriate, and to the question of what the legal system owes to Nizan and to every child like him. Nizan spent several days in the hospital, and his father was present throughout that time, remaining by his son's side in the way that parents do when they understand that the time remaining is limited and precious. And during those days, investigators came to take Nizan's statement because they understood that he was the primary witness to what had been done to him, and that his account, given while he was still alive, would carry extraordinary weight in the legal proceedings that were to follow. And Nizan, a 12-year-old child with burns inside his body and injuries on his face, found within himself the strength and the clarity to speak, to describe in his own words what had happened to him, to name the person who had forced him to drink the boiling water. and his statement was recorded and documented and became part of the formal legal record of the Sukabumi Police Department. And I want you to understand what that means in terms of the courage it required, because we have a tendency when we hear about children who speak in circumstances like this one to treat that speaking as simply something that happened, as a fact to be noted and moved past in the narrative. But it was not simply something that happened. It was a choice. It was an act of will performed by a child who had every reason to be afraid and who chose truth anyway, who chose to give investigators what they needed even as his own body was failing him. And that choice, that act of will, is one of the most significant things that Nizam Shafi ever did, and it deserves to be recognized as such. On Thursday, the 19th of February 2026, Nizam Shafi died, and the city of Sukabumi and the country of Indonesia and the wider world beyond Indonesia were left to grapple with what his death meant and what it required of them. And his father, carrying both grief and purpose, went to the police and formally reported the stepmother, transforming what could have remained a private tragedy into a matter of public legal record. And this decision by Nizam's father is one that should not be taken for granted, because reporting a family member to the police in Indonesia, as in many cultures, carries significant social weight. It means going outside the family. It means choosing the formal mechanisms of the state over the informal mechanisms of family resolution. It means making a public declaration that something wrong has been done and that it cannot be handled quietly and privately. And Nizam's father made that choice. He chose his son's justice over his own comfort. And that choice set in motion everything that followed. The Sukabumi Police Department, under the leadership of Senior Adjunct Commissioner Samian, responded to the father's report and to the evidence gathered during and after Nizam's hospitalization by opening a formal criminal investigation. And Commissioner Samian spoke publicly to Indonesian media confirming that investigators had found evidence of alleged physical and psychological violence against the child. And this public confirmation was important not only for the legal process, but for the national conversation about child protection that Nizam's case had ignited. Because when a police chief stands in front of cameras and confirms that a child was subjected to physical and psychological violence inside his own home, it sends a message to every person watching that this is being taken seriously, that the state is paying attention, that the lives of children matter enough to command the full resources of law enforcement. And the Indonesian public needed to hear that message in the specific case of Nizam Shafi, because the details of what had been done to him had already spread widely through social media and through the reporting of major outlets, and the reaction was one of profound collective grief and anger and a demand for accountability that the police and prosecutors would need to meet. The investigation proceeded along several parallel tracks simultaneously. Forensic investigators were working with the autopsy findings to build the physical evidence base. Interview teams were taking statements from everyone connected to the household. Digital and video evidence was being gathered and reviewed, and legal experts within the police department were working to construct the appropriate charges under Indonesian law, specifically under Law Number 35 of 2014, which amends the original Child Protection Act of 2002 and which provides the legal framework for prosecuting violence against children in Indonesia This law is significant because it recognizes both physical and psychological violence as criminal acts, and it provides for penalties that reflect the seriousness of harm done. To children in domestic settings, the maximum penalties under this law are substantial, and they increase significantly when the harm results in serious injury or death. And in Nizan's case, the harm had resulted in death, which means that prosecutors would be working within a legal framework that carries the most serious possible consequences for those found guilty. The stepmother, identified in Indonesian media by her initials TR, in accordance with the standard Indonesian journalistic practice of not publishing the full names of suspects before conviction, was formally designated as a tersangka, a suspect, under the child protection provisions of Indonesian law. And this formal designation represents a significant step in the Indonesian criminal process. It is not an arrest in the Western legal sense, but it is a formal acknowledgement by the state that there is sufficient evidence to investigate a specific individual as the responsible party. And it triggers a set of procedural obligations, including the obligation to refrain from leaving the jurisdiction, the obligation to cooperate with investigators, and the potential for detention if investigators determine that the suspect poses a flight risk or a risk of evidence tampering. The exact details of TR's status in terms of detention or release were not publicly confirmed in the initial reporting on the case, and these details will emerge as the legal process moves forward through its various stages. A video that circulated widely on Indonesian social media in the days following Nizan's death showed a scene that required no explanation for anyone who watched it. In the video, Nizan is seen being cared for by a man who repeatedly positions himself physically between the child and a woman who is attempting to approach. And while the identities of the adults in the video were not formally confirmed by police, the image captured something essential about the final chapter of Nizan's life. It captured a father trying with his body and his presence to do what he had perhaps not been able to do with enough consistency before. It captured the instinct of protection. And the fact that this video spread so widely across Indonesian social media reflects how deeply this case resonated with ordinary Indonesians, people who watched that footage and felt something shift inside them, who recognized in that man's attempt to shield his son a desperation that spoke to every parent's deepest fear, the fear of not being enough, of not arriving in time, of standing between your child and harm when the harm has already been done. Indonesia is a nation of over 270 million people, and it is a nation that has been reckoning seriously and publicly in recent years with its record on child protection. The KPAI, the Indonesian Child Protection Commission, releases annual reports on child welfare violations, and the numbers in those reports are not comfortable reading. Indonesia records thousands of cases of child abuse each year, and the gap between cases that are reported and cases that actually occur is widely understood to be enormous, because so much abuse happens inside families, and so many families and communities use informal mechanisms of resolution that keep cases out of the formal legal system entirely. The reasons for this gap are complex and culturally rooted, and they include a reluctance to involve the state in family matters, a belief in some communities that physical discipline of children is a parental right rather than a form of abuse, a fear of social stigma for the family if abuse becomes public knowledge, and a lack of awareness among children themselves about what constitutes abuse and what resources are available to them. All of these factors create an environment in which children who are being harmed have limited access to the pathways that might lead to intervention. And Nizan Shafi's case, with its tragic outcome and its courageous conclusion, has the potential to shift some of those factors, to change the conversation, to make the invisible visible in a way that protects the next child. The child protection system in Indonesia has made genuine progress in recent years, and it is important to acknowledge that progress even while acknowledging how much remains to be done. The passage of Law Number 23 of 2002 and its subsequent amendment in 2014 created a legal framework that is genuinely serious about child welfare. The establishment of the KPAI as an independent monitoring body gave the country an institutional mechanism for tracking and responding to child welfare violations, and the increasing willingness of Indonesian media to report on cases of child abuse with the kind of detail and seriousness that commands public attention has been an important factor in shifting social norms around what is acceptable within families. But legal frameworks and institutional mechanisms and media coverage are only as effective as their implementation. They are only as powerful as the people who use them and the communities that support their use. And in too many cases across Indonesia, the gap between the law on paper and the law in practice remains wide enough for children to fall through. Nizan Shafi fell through that gap, and he did not survive it, but he did not fall silently. And that distinction matters in ways that extend far beyond his individual case. Because every child who speaks and is heard before they are gone leaves behind a record, a testimony, a thread of accountability that the legal system can follow and that the public record can preserve. And every case that is prosecuted seriously sends a message to every family in Indonesia, and beyond that, the state is watching. That the walls of private homes are not impenetrable to the reach of child protection law. That children have rights that exist independently of the willingness of their caregivers to respect them. And Nizan's case, because it has received the level of public attention that it has received, and because it is being investigated with the seriousness that Commissioner Samian's public statements reflect, has the potential to be one of those cases that shifts something, that becomes a reference point, that gets cited in future discussions of child protection policy and enforcement in Indonesia. There are warning signs that communities and schools and neighbors and extended family members can learn to recognize in the children around them. And it is worth spending time with these because awareness is the first and most accessible form of child protection that ordinary people have access to. A child who arrives at school repeatedly with unexplained injuries or injuries whose explanations do not match their physical characteristics. A child who seems unusually fearful or anxious in ways that are new or that do not match the child's baseline personality. A child who becomes withdrawn or stops participating in activities they previously enjoyed. A child who seems to be always hungry or always tired in ways that suggest their basic needs are not being consistently met at home. A child who flinches reflexively when adults move quickly near them. A child who expresses fear about going home or who finds reasons to stay at school or at neighbors' homes as long as possible. A child who does not report injuries or who reports them in ways that seem rehearsed or that change when asked follow-up questions. None of these signs is definitive on its own, and none of them proves that abuse is occurring. But each of them is worth attention, worth a gentle and careful conversation, worth a call to a child protection hotline to ask for guidance from someone with the training to assess what is being observed. And in Indonesia, that call can be made to the KPAI or to Komnas PA, the National Commission for Child Protection, both of which have mechanisms for receiving reports and connecting children and families with appropriate support and intervention services. Nizam Shafi was 12 years old, and he lived in Sukabumi, and he was in the 6th grade, and he had a father who loved him, and he had a future that the world owed him and did not deliver. And we do not know what he dreamed about at night when the house was quiet and the mountains outside were dark against the sky. We do not know what made him laugh, or what subjects at school captured his imagination, or what he wanted to be when the crossroads of 6th grade finally opened onto the wider road of junior high, and then senior high, and then adulthood. We do not know these things because they never happened, because the world moved too slowly and the harm moved too fast. But we know that he existed fully and completely in the way that all children exist, with a face and a voice and a way of being in the world that was entirely his own. And we know that at the end, he chose truth. He spoke his experience out loud in the presence of investigators. He named what had been done to him and who had done it. And his words are now preserved in the legal record of Sukabumi and in the reporting of Indonesian journalists and in the public memory of everyone who has heard his name and understood its weight. And in speaking his name here tonight, this channel is doing what all careful and respectful true crime content attempts to do at its best. It is refusing to let the people at the center of these stories be reduced to their suffering. It is insisting that Nizam Shafi was a person before he was a victim, and that his personhood matters more than his tragedy, and that his name deserves to be spoken with the same care and dignity that we would want for the names of our own children. The legal process in Indonesia will continue to move forward in the months ahead, and the investigation into TR will proceed through the stages of the Indonesian criminal justice system toward a formal trial and eventually a verdict. And when that verdict comes, it will represent the fulfillment of the promise that the state makes to every child within its borders. The promise that harm done to you will be taken seriously, that the person who harmed you will be held accountable, that your suffering will not be erased or minimized or explained away. And whether that promise is fully kept in Nizam's case will depend on prosecutors and judges and the integrity of the legal process. But the foundation has been laid, the evidence has been gathered, the suspect has been named, and most importantly, the words of a 12-year-old boy have been recorded and preserved and will be present in that courtroom when the time comes. And those words, spoken in pain and in courage by a child who had every reason to be silent and chose to speak anyway, are the most powerful evidence of all. For anyone following this case, the outlets that have provided the most thorough and credible coverage are TV One News, the Jakarta Post, and Kompas.id, all of which will continue to report on developments as the investigation and trial proceed. And for anyone in Indonesia who has concerns about a child's safety or who needs to report suspected abuse, The KPAI can be reached through the Indonesian government's official child protection channels, and Comnas PA operates a reporting hotline that is available to the public. Please use these resources. Please do not wait. Please do not assume that someone else has already made the call, because in the cases where intervention comes in time, it almost always comes because one person decided that what they were seeing was serious enough to act on. And you might be that person for a child who has no one else. And so we arrive at the end of tonight's story. And I want to thank you sincerely for being here, for choosing to spend this hour with a story that asked something difficult of you, for listening with the kind of attention that Nizan deserved. Sleep well tonight. Let your breath slow and your body soften, and the rain that has been with us throughout this hour carry you gently toward rest. Somewhere in Sukabumi, the air is cool and the mountains are dark, and a boy named Nizan Shafi is remembered. He is spoken, he is not forgotten, and that is what we can give him now. Our memory, our attention, our willingness to say his name and mean it. Good night. I will be here tomorrow night.